There are roles that make actors famous, and then there are roles that change them forever. For Gary Sinise, Forrest Gump was both. When he stepped into the uniform of Lieutenant Dan Taylor, he didn't just play a man broken by war. He became part of a story that would reshape his own life. Decades later, Sinise still admits that the character never truly left him. What began as a performance on screen turned into a lifelong mission off it, one that would carry both triumph and tragedy, the role that defined him. When Forrest Gump premiered on July 6, 1994, audiences fell in love with its simple hero, its unforgettable soundtrack, and its sweeping story of innocence and destiny. But beneath the film's optimism was one of its most haunting performances, Gary Sinise as Lieutenant Dan. At that point, Sinise wasn't yet a household name. He was a Chicago stage actor, co-founder of the Steppenwolf Theater Company, known mainly in theater circles. Yet his portrayal of the bitter, wounded veteran would earn him an Academy Award nomination, and something much deeper than fame. For Sinise, the character of Lieutenant Dan was personal. His brother-in-law had served in Vietnam, and Sinise had grown up surrounded by veterans who rarely spoke of what they had seen. When he read the script, he recognized something painfully real: the survivor's guilt, the anger, the loss of purpose. He approached the role with total seriousness, even wearing his brother-in-law's rosary during filming as a private tribute. Making Lieutenant Dan believable wasn't easy. The special effects team had to digitally remove Sinise's legs using early blue screen technology, a complex process that required the actor to sit in a specially designed wheelchair that kept his legs hidden but left him in constant discomfort. "I could only film for 10 minutes at a time," Sinise later said. But the pain, both physical and emotional, became part of the performance. When audiences saw Lieutenant Dan raging against God, drinking himself into despair and later finding redemption, they saw more than acting. They saw truth. That truth hit veterans especially hard. For the first time in years, someone on screen understood them, their wounds, their bitterness, and their silence. When Forrest Gump won the Oscar for Best Picture, Sinise's name became synonymous with Lieutenant Dan. But what he didn't yet know was that the character he played would follow him long after the cameras stopped rolling. The Awakening. After Forrest Gump, Gary Sinise could have taken the easy road. Hollywood wanted him. Directors were calling, studios were offering big paychecks, and his face was suddenly recognizable everywhere. But something inside him had shifted. The story of Lieutenant Dan, the soldier who lost everything yet found meaning again, stayed in his mind. He had played a wounded veteran. Now he felt responsible for the real ones. In interviews years later, Sinise said the role opened his eyes to a reality he couldn't ignore. During filming, he had spent time with veterans, listening to their stories, men who had lost limbs, sight, and sometimes hope. After the movie wrapped, those memories haunted him. He started visiting veterans' hospitals quietly, without cameras. "I couldn't just walk away," he explained. "I'd seen too much." Then came September 11th, 2001, a moment that would redefine his purpose. Watching the towers fall, Sinise thought of the soldiers who would be sent overseas and of the first responders risking their lives at home. Not long after, he met a New York firefighter who had lost all 4 limbs in the attack. The man needed a house that could accommodate his condition, and Sinise stepped in, personally raising the money to build it. That experience changed everything. He realized that one act of kindness wasn't enough. There were thousands of wounded heroes just like that man. That was when the seed of the Gary Sinise Foundation was planted. Founded officially in 2011, the organization became his second career, a calling. Through it, he raised millions for veterans, first responders, and their families. By 2025, the foundation was generating over $30 million a year, funding smart homes, therapy programs, and emergency aid for soldiers injured in combat. He even acquired a small fleet of private jets to transport wounded service members and their families to medical centers around the world. Yet despite the scale of his success, Sinise often spoke about the emotional toll it took. "You can't meet that many broken lives without carrying some of it with you," he said. He was no longer just an actor who once played a soldier. He had become a real-world advocate, a bridge between Hollywood and the forgotten heroes he now saw as his true audience. But this transformation came with a cost. The deeper he immersed himself in their pain, the harder it became to separate their suffering from his own. And when tragedy eventually struck his own family, he would find himself walking the same path of strength and loss that so many of them knew all too well. The tragedy that tested his faith. By the time Gary Sinise entered his late 60s, he had become something rare in Hollywood, a man admired not for fame, but for compassion. He had turned a movie role into a mission, and millions respected him for it. But in 2018, life dealt him a blow that no camera or cause could prepare him for. His only son, McKenna Anthony "Mac" Sinise, was diagnosed with a rare spinal cancer called chordoma, a disease that affects barely 300 people in the United States each year. Mac was 30 years old then, young, talented, and full of life. A graduate of the USC Thornton School of Music, he had inherited his father's creativity and discipline. As a drummer in the Lieutenant Dan Band, he had toured military bases, playing for wounded soldiers who saw hope in his father's work. But now it was Mac who needed courage. 2 months before his diagnosis, Gary's wife, Moira Harris, had been told she had stage 3 breast cancer. The family faced 2 battles at once, one of the body and one of the soul. Moira went through chemotherapy and eventually entered remission. But Mac's cancer was relentless. It spread along his spine, slowly robbing him of movement, forcing him to adapt to a body that was turning against him. Gary described those years as both sacred and devastating. "As parents, it's so difficult losing a child," he said in a statement later. "Our family's cancer fight lasted 5.5 years. It became more and more challenging as time went on, yet through it all, he stood by his son's side, watching him compose music, create, and give, even as his strength faded. He fought an uphill battle against a cancer that has no cure," Gary wrote. But he never quit trying. On January 5, 2024, Mac passed away at age 33. In his obituary, Gary called him an incredible inspiration to those who knew and loved him. He said he was proud to have been his father, blessed even, though his heart was shattered. Friends say Gary's faith and his years of working with wounded veterans were the only things that kept him grounded. He had seen so many people lose loved ones to war and tragedy. Now he understood their pain firsthand. When he returned to the stage with the Lieutenant Dan Band months later, his voice cracked as he addressed the crowd. "This one's for Mac," he said quietly. The audience stood in silence. In that moment, Lieutenant Dan, the man who had lost his legs but found his purpose, lived again through Gary Sinise, who had now faced his own kind of loss and was learning once more how to live with it. A career beyond fame, the mission that never ended. After Mac's death, Gary Sinise didn't retreat from the world, though few would have blamed him if he had. Instead, he did what he had always done. He turned grief into purpose. "When you lose someone, you either fall apart or you carry them with you," he once said. "I chose to carry him." His foundation became more than just a charity. It became his therapy. Founded in 2011, the Gary Sinise Foundation had already built dozens of smart homes for wounded veterans, equipped with voice controls, ramps, and adaptive technology. But after 2024, every project carried a deeper emotional weight. Each home built, each concert played, each soldier helped was, in his words, a way to keep Mac's spirit alive. Gary often said that Forrest Gump didn't just give him fame, it gave him a mission. The film had shown a man who lost his legs but rediscovered his will to live. In a strange, almost poetic way, Sinise's own life had mirrored that arc. Lieutenant Dan had to learn to stand again without legs. Gary had to learn to stand again without his son. He threw himself into work. His band, the Lieutenant Dan Band, co-founded in 2003 with musician Kimo Williams, began touring again, performing for veterans, families, and survivors of trauma. By 2019, the group had played more than 400 concerts worldwide, often on military bases and at hospitals. When Gary spoke between songs, he didn't talk about movies or Hollywood. He talked about service, resilience, and gratitude. For his decades of advocacy, Sinise earned some of the highest civilian honors in America: the Presidential Citizens Medal from George W. Bush in 2008, the Bob Hope Award for Excellence in Entertainment, and the Spirit of the USO Award. Yet he never acted like a celebrity receiving trophies. To him, these were reminders that the work mattered, that stories could save lives long after the credits rolled. When asked if he ever grew tired of being known as Lieutenant Dan, Sinise smiled. "Not at all," he said. "That character opened every door that I've walked through since. If people call me Lieutenant Dan, that's fine. It means they remember the soldiers. It means they remember why we did this." Even in the darkest moments, he kept perspective. "I've met people with injuries far worse than mine, with losses far deeper than mine," he told a reporter in 2024. "And yet they smile, they fight, they live. That's where I draw strength." He wasn't exaggerating. For 3 decades, Gary Sinise had watched the human spirit bend but not break, in war zones, in hospitals, and finally, in his own home. And through all of it, he remained exactly what Lieutenant Dan became by the film's end: a survivor who learned that redemption isn't something you find on a movie set. It's something you earn, one act of kindness at a time. The legacy of Lieutenant Dan, from film to real life. 30 years after Forrest Gump first hit theaters, Gary Sinise can still recall the moment that changed everything. The movie opened in July of 1994, he told Forbes in 2024. And a month later, I was invited to the National Convention of Disabled American Veterans. When he stepped onto that stage, more than 2,000 wounded veterans were waiting for him. "They started cheering like I was Elvis," he said, laughing softly. "And then I saw all the wheelchairs, and I just broke down." That moment was more than emotion. It was recognition. Sinise realized that Lieutenant Dan wasn't just a character. He was a mirror. Veterans saw themselves in Dan's rage, his shame, and finally his recovery. For decades, Hollywood had portrayed soldiers as either heroes or victims. But Lieutenant Dan was something else entirely, a man crushed by fate who learned to live again. For thousands of veterans, that story was their story. In the Forbes interview, Sinise reflected on the impact of that connection. "It opened a door for me to understand what so many of them were going through," he said. "That role changed the direction of my entire life." He laughed when he mentioned how Tom Hanks had once called him after seeing the early footage. He said, "Gosh, I just saw your stuff. It's like Clark Gable walked on the stage." I'd barely done 3 movies at that point. That kind of encouragement meant everything. Tom Hanks and Gary Sinise would go on to share more than just screen time. After Forrest Gump, they reunited in Apollo 13 and The Green Mile, both massive critical successes. But the bond they formed went deeper than work. Hanks often said that Sinise's dedication to veterans was one of the most meaningful legacies ever born from a film. "He didn't just play a soldier," Hanks once told an interviewer. "He became a guardian for them." When Forrest Gump celebrated its 30th anniversary in 2024, Sinise couldn't help but smile at the old footage. "I looked pretty good back then," he joked. "Lieutenant Dan was a stud." But behind the humor was a quiet pride, not in the fame, but in the meaning that the role had carried through time. He said that playing Lieutenant Dan taught him what resilience truly meant. You fall down, you suffer. But if you have people who love you, you get up again. And that's exactly what Gary Sinise did, again and again. He has watched his country change, his family suffer, his faith tested, and his career evolve. But through it all, the shadow of Lieutenant Dan has never faded. It became part of his identity, not as a burden, but as a promise. I owe that character everything, he admitted. He gave me purpose, reflection, and redemption. In 2025, Gary Sinise is 70 years old. His hair is grayer, his movements slower, but his energy, the quiet fire that has fueled him since Forrest Gump, remains untouched. He no longer chases Hollywood roles. Instead, he devotes his time to the Gary Sinise Foundation, which continues to expand its reach. What began as a modest effort to build homes for wounded soldiers has become one of the most trusted charities in America. Every year, he attends ceremonies where veterans receive the keys to new smart homes, homes his foundation helped design. He doesn't make grand speeches anymore. He simply shakes hands, hugs families, and listens. When he's asked how long he'll keep doing this work, his answer never changes. As long as I can breathe. Sinise's wife, Moira, is still by his side, now healthy after her fight with cancer. Together, they've weathered tragedy with grace. Losing their son Mac changed them, but it didn't destroy them. Grief doesn't disappear, Gary has said. You just learn to walk with it. He keeps a drumstick from one of Mac's performances on his desk, a daily reminder of strength, music, and love that never ends. Looking back, he often reflects on how one film, just a 2-hour story made 3 decades ago, rewrote the course of his life. Lieutenant Dan showed me what real courage looks like, he once said. Not the kind in movies. The kind you find in hospitals, in wheelchairs, and families who keep going after loss. To younger actors, Sinise is living proof that a role can mean more than fame. To veterans, he's family. And to those who've known loss, whether in war, illness, or life itself, he's a symbol of how pain can become purpose. When asked in 2025 whether he still identifies with Lieutenant Dan, Sinise smiled gently. He'll always be with me, he said. Because in the end, Lieutenant Dan found peace. And I think, so have I. Gary Sinise's story reminds us that sometimes a single role can change an entire life. Not through awards or fame, but through empathy and courage. What do you think? Is Gary Sinise one of the few actors who turned fiction into something truly real? Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories behind Hollywood's most unforgettable transformations.